So I want to get started. My name is Harry Hockheiser. I'm the director of the MIDAS Center, and I want to welcome you to the January 2022 monthly MIDAS webinar. Today, we're very pleased to have a nice presentation from Dr. Folashade Agusto. Yes. Dr. Agusto has a PhD in mathematics from the University of Ilorin in Nigeria. She has trained as a postdoc at the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Sciences. She was previously faculty at the Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, and she is now on the faculty of the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, where we are assured that it is not flat, even though it is in Kansas. And Dr. Agusto is going to talk to us about ticks and fire this afternoon. And so we're really looking forward to the talk. Thank you, Dr. Agusto. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to be talking specifically about modeling the effects of prescribed fire on Lyme disease. As outlined to this talk, I will give a brief introduction on some Lyme disease statistics. Then I will talk a little bit about prescribed fire. I will introduce two different impulsive models. One is especially implicit, and we actually started this study with this very model. And the other impulsive model is spatially explicit. I will give results of some scenarios that we ran, and I will close with a summary. Now, tick-borne illnesses from both endemic and emerging tick-borne pathogens have shown dramatic increase in recent times, as we see in this particular figure. And this represents an increasing public health risk in the country. So for instance, Lyme disease has gone from 4 cases per 100,000 people in the 1990s to 10 cases per 100,000 people in the early 2000s. Now, this risk continues to evolve as new pathogens are discovered. Here are the pathogens that have been discovered in 1960, from 1960 till 2020. Now, it is not helpful that this tick species are also expanding their geographical ranges. These are maps of 2 geographical ranges of 2 exotic species in 1960, 1996, and in 2020. And you can see how much the tick species has expanded, especially towards the eastern part of the country. Now, this expansion is not limited to the exotic species. The map on the left, so this map on the left shows the current location of Amblyomma americanum, and the one on the right is showing the future prediction of its expansion, which is mostly towards the northern parts of the country. Now, overall, there are at least 18 established tick-borne infectious diseases, pathogen and diseases from Lyme disease to bovine virus disease. There are 20 known conditions like the alpha-gal. Lyme disease is caused by Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria, which are mainly present in black-legged ticks, specifically during their nymphal stage of their life cycle. Here is a tick identification chart, and you can see how they compare to a dime. So they're really, really small. And the names particularly constitute the most risk to human when it comes to Lyme disease. And ticks have complicated life cycle that span 2 to 3 years, depending on the tick species. And ticks have 4 life stages. We have the eggs, the larvae, the nymphs, and the adults. And the eggs are laid, so the eggs are laid in spring, and this then hatch and mature into larvae. The larvae take host, they need a blood meal to be able to mature into the next life stage, which is the nymph stage, which happens in the following spring. Now, this hatch or this mature larvae then seek hosts for another blood's meal. So these are the array of hosts that they can feed on. And then they mature into adults in fall. And then these adults also need larger mammals in this case to be able to feed on. And once they're fed, they lay eggs in the spring of the following year. So now switching to talking a little bit about prescribed fire, which are intentional fire, which are necessary for land and forest management, farming, prairie restoration, and greenhouse gas abatement. Controlled fire appealing, particularly appealing due to their time and cost efficiency, along with their ability to be applied across a large amount of land. They are also effective in controlling tick population because it kills the ticks and destroys their leaf litter habitats. They generally happen in the late spring and early summer, and this time coincides with when most of the nymph population are questing for hosts. So this is a historical map of the mean fire intervals prior to the widespread of industrial influence, before the increase in land use, fire suppression, and climate change. Now, looking at this map, you can see that the southern parts of the country generally burn more frequently than the northern parts and the western parts of the country. However, since the 1900s, fire frequency have been on a decline, as we see here in this data from New Hampshire and New Jersey. Now, looking at both fire, ticks and fire, if we superimpose onto the historical fire frequency map, this map on this amblyomap prediction map on the left, we'll see this gray line here represents the future predicted region, and then the black line is where they're currently at. And you can clearly see from here that the future prediction is towards the area where we have fewer fire frequency. Of course, we have other factors that would influence or influences this expansion. So factors like climate change and bird migration. Now, while in this presentation, I'm talking about tick-borne disease that are important to the US, ticks are found worldwide, and so is the occurrence of prescribed fire and fire incidences. So for instance, this is Amblyoma aviarum, which causes Rickettsia in Africa. So this is an Africa-related tick and tick-borne disease. Here is a map of the range of pathogenic and unknown pathogenic Rickettsia across northern and sub-Saharan Africa. And Africa is known as the fire continent, as you saw in that previous slide that I showed you of the global map of the average annual area burned from 1960 to 2000. Now, research in the effects of fire regime on the African ecosystem have been conducted since the early 20th century. Now, this has led to a general understanding of the effects of different types of fire and fire intensity, as well as the understanding of the season and the frequency of burning of the grass and tree components of the vegetation. All right, so to this very study. So our goal is actually twofold. So one is to show the effects of prescribed fire intensity and the duration between the burn on tick population and Lyme disease prevalence. And by intensity, we're considering low and high fire intensities. And two, we want to consider the effectiveness of the burn on different spatial domains. So I will start by considering the effects of low and high fire intensities, as well as the duration between the burns on the prevalence of the disease. So to address this first question, we use this extremely simple spatial implicit compartmental model for Lyme disease in ticks. This red compartment represents the small mammal host population, and the ones in blue are for the ticks. So the host population are divided according to their disease status. So we have the susceptible host, and then we have the infected host. Similarly, we divided the tick population according to their disease status. So we have the susceptible and the infected. And we further segmented the tick population according to their life stages. So we have the eggs, the larvae, the nymphs, and the adults. Now, for this model, we did not incorporate the host-seeking behavior of the ticks. So like I said, it's a really simple model. And so we are expanding this work further to incorporate that host-seeking behavior of the ticks. There are no vertical transmission when it comes to Lyme disease in ticks, and so this does not include that. So with this model, we have the following system of ordinary differential equation. Now, to capture the effect of fire, we use an impulsive system where before the application of the fire, our model follows the ordinary differential equation that I had shown you earlier on. And when fire is applied at time t, both the host and the tick population are reduced by a certain proportion. Now, to estimate the parameters capturing the two fire intensities, we use data from literature. And currently, we are in talks with some folks at our field station here at KU who are doing some experiments on fire, and so they will be collecting tick data for us alongside. So first, we use the data from Padkett 2009 paper to estimate the related parameter for high intensity, and we use the data from Gilliam 2018 paper to estimate the low intensity related parameters. The Padkett 2009 paper had fire data for 6 tick species and rodents, but we use the data for Ixodes pacifica since they can transmit Lyme disease. While the data for Gilliam 2018 paper has fire data for 3 tick species, and so and we use the data for Ixodes capillaris, which also transmits ticks. Now, this Gilliam's paper does not include rodents, neither does it have any control in it. So from the Padkett paper, we estimated the parameter quantifying the reduction in the tick and the host population as a result of fire. So we took the difference in the number of ticks in the control and the burn side, and we normalized it by the total tick population from their study. So next, we simulated the model using data from literature for the other model parameters, and then the estimated population reduction proportion that we estimated from as a result of fire. So this figure looks at the difference in the infectious nymph population between the low and high fire intensity. And we specifically focus on the infectious nymphs since they pose the most risk to humans in getting Lyme disease. So on the x-axis, I have time in years. On the y-axis, I have the number of infectious nymphs. The pink curve represents low fire intensity. The dashed blue curve represents the high fire intensity, and we simulate this for just a period of 6 years. While we have the same number of ticks at the very beginning before the application of fire in the first year, so once we apply fire, you can start to see the distinction between the low intensity and the high intensity. So the high fire intensity does very well in reducing the number of ticks compared to the low intensity. So next, we consider the effect of the duration between the burns. On the left, we have low intensity. On the right, we have high intensity. The purple curve represents the situation where we were burning one time every year for a period of 6 years. The yellow, this is yellow. The yellow represents the situation where we burn every 2 years for a period of 6 years. And now the orange is when we burn one time every 3 years for a period of 6 years. And then the blue, we burn just one time in 6 years. And you can clearly see that the low intensity burn is less effective compared to the high intensity burn. And the burn efficiency or effectiveness increases with the as the duration between the burn decreases. So for instance, if we burn every 2 years at high intensity, this led to fewer number of ticks compared to when we burn at low intensity every 2 years for that period of 6 years. Also, if we burn every 2 years, we get fewer ticks compared to if we burn every 3 years, regardless of whether we're doing low intensity or high intensity burn. So overall, intensity has a larger influence on tick reduction than the duration of the burn. So you can clearly see that by comparing the high intensity burn of burning every year to when you compare that to burning low intensity when you burn every year. So this means that it's better to burn fewer times at higher intensity than to burn more often at low intensity. So I have been considering the effects of low and high fire intensities, as well as the duration between the burns on the prevalence of the disease. So now I'm going to switch gear and talk about the effectiveness of the burn on different spatial domains. So to do that, we extended our model by adding spatial dependency. So for instance, this is the host population. And so they do not just depend on time, they also depend on the X and Y location on a spatial grid. We added diffusion to some of the model population in order for us to be able to capture the dispersal of the population across space. And we consider a solution over a two-dimensional rectangular domain, omega. And this is the model with spatial dependency, and we have suppressed that from what I'm showing you right now for the sake of compactness. And here are the diffusion term that capture the dispersal of the of our agents. Let me call them agents across the spatial domain. And this, of course, is subject to the prescribed burn at the time that we applied the burn. Now, this reaction diffusion system is coupled with a homogeneous Newman boundary condition, as well as the initial conditions that we set when we're running the simulation. So in our model, we use constant diffusion to model uniform dispersal of the population across space. So later on, we relax this condition when we consider heterogeneous domain. To solve this impulsive PDE system, we use the mesh movement and finite element package which is written in R. Now, this package was developed by Dr. Weizhang Hong, my colleague and collaborator on this project. This finite elements method splits our spatial domain into smaller, easier to solve subdomain or elements. We then calculate our solutions over each of the smaller elements, and we add them all up to get the full solution at one point in time. So we use the implicit fifth order Radal 2A method in time with variable time step. So next, I will present results of some scenarios that we ran when we assume ticks and Lyme disease are already endemic in an area. So as with the ODE system, we simulated the PDE using data from literature and the estimated reduction in the ticks and the host population as a result of fire. So in this scenario, the ticks are distributed evenly across homogeneous domain omega. And omega is a 30 by 30 square block with prescribed fire happening in a 10 by 10 block right in the middle of the domain. And we have these fire occurrences annually for a period of 10 years. And you can clearly see here this immediate reduction in the tick population at time T1. At T3, you can begin to see the effect of diffusion back into this burnt patch, and this becomes really clear at T5. So it's more noticeable. Now, over time, we see the number of ticks in and around the burn sites have significantly been reduced compared to the area around the edges of the domain. So this area around the edges of the domain where we do not have fire happening. So the fire effect is not getting there, but nevertheless, you can see this diffusion or recovery of this patch domain as the ticks are diffusing back in them. But nevertheless, the number of ticks in those patches are low. So as with the ODE system, we see that this reduction in the percentage of ticks increases with the number of burns that we have. And this reduction also increases with the burnt patch, with the patch size of the burnt patch. So the bigger the patch that we burn, the fewer the ticks that we get at the end. And this of course can be attributed in part to the effect of the diffusion and the speed of the recovery of the ticks both in that patch, because as the ticks are diffusing into that burnt patch, you burn them again, and so overall it's leading to a reduction in the overall ticks that you have. So next, we exploit the effects of prescribed fire in a homogeneous domain, which captures the different environment that the ticks can be found. And we split the 30 by 30 square domain omega into two non-uniform domains. The first domain here, x less than 1, represents a grassland, which of course is less suitable environment for ticks because it generally has higher temperature and lower humidity. And so as a result, we set the diffusion rates to be lower in this domain. And then the second domain here, where x is greater than 15, represents a wooded advantageous environment for the ticks, in that they have a higher rate of diffusion with plenty of litter and space to hide when temperature increases or humidity drops. And as before, we burn a 10 by 10 square block in a diagonal fashion. So we burn this diagonal corner of a domain. And as we saw previously, at time T1, we have this reduction at the burn patch. However, at time T3 and T, you can clearly see the difference between the two patches as we begin to see more of the ticks diffusing into that borne patch of the advantageous environment compared to the less advantageous grassland environment. And at the end of a simulation period, you can clearly see the effect of burning in the advantageous environments, which have fewer number of ticks beyond the burnt patch, even extending to this region that we have here for the grassland. And so persistently burning in an environment that is better suited for ticks is more effective at reducing the number of ticks both in and around the area that is burnt. Lastly, we explore the effect of prescribed burn on the invasion of ticks into new environments. So if we introduce ticks at the corner of the domain in this 10 by 10 block, we start to see the formation of this traveling wave as the ticks propagate across the domain if left uncontrolled. And this becomes obvious at the end of a 20-year simulation. So you can see that the ticks had almost completely taken over the entire 30 by 30 block. However, if we implement prescribed burn, a scattered prescribed burn, so to say, every 5 years over the 20-year period, you can see the 20-year period, particularly, especially in this patch of introduction, this 10 by 10 patch of introduction. So you can see the disruption in the propagation of the in that particular patch of introduction. So if you compare what we have here to what we have in the scenario without the control. You see the disruption. However, the leading edge of the propagation of the ticks remain pretty much the same. Now, on the other hand, if we burn the patch, the patch of introduction, so that's this 10 by 10 block, if we burn this yearly for a period of 20 years, we see this tremendous disruption of the propagation of the ticks. And this propagation, of course, is much slower. Unfortunately, the establishment of ticks is maybe inevitable. And so this shows us that it's necessary to pair the prescribed burn with other forms of tick population management strategy, like the use of pesticide, for instance, in order to slow and possibly prevent the spread and establishment of the ticks. Now, this, of course, with this, we can ask the question, where do we place these other controls? Should it be at the patch of introduction or at the leading edge of the invasion in order to prevent the further propagation of the ticks? So these are some of the questions that we're asking and we're also further working on. Okay, so to conclude, I have presented two impulsive systems, one which is implicit in space and the other which is explicit in space, to determine the effect of fire intensity on disease prevalence. Generally, we saw that burning at high intensity is preferable to burning at low intensity, and this should be done whenever possible. Because high intensity fire may be unrealistic due to environmental factors and concern, particularly in this age of climate change. And we saw that location of the prescribed burn can be crucial in determining its effectiveness. So burning in an environment suitable for ticks, like the wooded area, can lead to fewer number of ticks, unlike the grassland that are not suitable due to high temperature and low humidity. And then lastly, we saw that it may be better to implement other control measures to slow the propagation of the ticks into new environments to prevent the propagation and establishment of ticks. And of course, this presents its own set of questions. And these are the folks that, these are my research things. So this one got started with Emily Gao over the COVID-19 pandemic. And the work has continued with my grad student, Alexander Falk. And this is Professor Waizhong Hong, who developed the finite element software that we're using for our simulation. Now, before I close, I'm going to shamelessly plug in to say that my lab is looking for grad students to help address some of the interesting questions that have come up as a result of this research. And of course, I've shared some of these questions with you. We have other questions that I didn't share because it's not related to this presentation at this moment. This work was supported by an NSF grant under the EPSCoR Track 2 grant. So thank you. I will take your questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Agusto. Really interesting talk. Please, if you have questions, raise your hand or put something in the Q&A or the chat and let us know. I will start off with the question I have for you.
Okay.
I'm a little bit curious here about, well, several things I could think of, but I'll start with this question of the counting of the tick-borne disease and the relationship between the prevalence of ticks and the prevalence of disease. So I guess the first question is, do we have good counts of how prevalent these diseases are? Mm-hmm. And what's the strength of the relationship between the tick population and the prevalence of the disease?
Is it in terms of the model that I'm presenting, but generally?
Either way.
Also, in terms of the model that I'm presenting, so this model just looks at, since it's disease related, and so we're keeping track of the prevalence of the disease. And so all the figures I've shown is just focusing on the infected nymph population. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're using as a measure in terms of this particular research work. In terms of overall, in terms of the prevalence of the ticks, I know that, including our group, there are folks out there counting ticks. And also, once they collect these ticks in the field, they're also trying to keep track or test these ticks for the prevalence of the ticks. I'm not sure I'm answering the question very well in terms of the relationship.
No, I guess I was just wondering that some of these diseases can be difficult to diagnose. So Lyme disease may or may not be that easy to diagnose. And I'm just wondering if there's some undercounting going on in actual prevalence. But
Right. Well, yeah, you're right about that in terms of the undercounting, because of the fact that they're not easy to diagnose, and sometimes with Lyme disease things happen. People, it gets into these advanced stages before people actually know that they've been infected, and those nymph population, those infected nymphs are really small. So people don't know that they even got the bites to start with. But this particular model that I have does not include humans. So it's just the tick population and the mammal population, excluding humans. But there are models that incorporates humans as well. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions here. So the first question here, thank you for the great presentation. Could you please clarify why in 10 equals 10, the number of ticks increases to 1,000, what is the assumption of fire frequency in this situation?
Okay. So in the patch where we're creating the burn, we're also having diffusion. So we have diffusion happening at the same time. And so that the fact that we have diffusion happening, that is leading to the increase in the number of ticks. And as far as the fire intensity is concerned, for the spatially explicit model, we used the high fire intensity data. We didn't use the low intensity data. The first study that we did with the system of ordinary differential equation, that's where we were comparing the different fire intensity. And with that, the high intensity gave fewer number of ticks. And the number of ticks did not change regardless of what we do, except if we're changing the times that we were applying the burn. So diffusion plays a role in the increase that we're seeing in that 10 by 10 block where we were applying the burn.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Another question here, do you think the use of satellite data could help further evaluate how the length and extent of fires may impact incidence and tick presence?
Well, that's part of our goal. So we're just starting with this work. So I said we have other questions that we want to address. So that's part of our goal. And we have, as part of our team, some folks down in Oklahoma who are experts in this. And so we are hoping to use the satellite data from their study when it comes to this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to throw another one out myself.
Okay.
One thing that I don't see here is any discussion or thought as to how the populations of the ticks are reducing, and it seems to be implied that essentially they're being burned or killed by the fires. Mm-hmm. Have you given any thought to, or is there any concern or relevance of predators for the ticks and how they might be affected by fires, or does that come into play at all?
You are just taking all my questions. So, like I said, again, this is the beginning of this study, and we have tons and tons of questions that we also want to address. Predators is one of them. Hunting of the host is one of them. So we have tons and tons of questions. So we just started this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I assume that the complexity would get pretty significant pretty quickly if you tried to tackle all of these at once. So completely understood. You have to start with the simpler model before you can move on to the more complex. Yeah. Very, very good point. It seems that you could get some pretty interesting dynamics there if the predators were killed off at a faster rate than the ticks. That might be very interesting. Right. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, fascinating. I guess the other question that comes up here may go a little bit of scope, out of scope beyond the modeling itself. But I would just be curious to hear if you have any thoughts about this, because it really does relate to what so many people in this community have been coming up with in terms of looking at COVID, is the translation between models and communicating to people in terms of policy. And so it sounds to me like you'd have an interesting question, or seems to me like you might have an interesting question, even if your models were compelling, to get the folks who set, say, forest and public land policy to do this kind of burns might be fairly difficult. So is there any work or thought or idea of how predictions like this might be used to talk to policymakers?
That's a very great question. That it's something that we have, well, me and my grad student have thought about, but luckily for us on our team, on a bigger team, because the modeling part is just a subset of it. On our team, we have members. Well, we have people who are connected to CDC, members of our governing body not governing body, members of our advisory board, not governing body, members of our advisory board. So we have a CDC person, and we have veterinary people who are connected to veterinarians as part of our team that can help with this messaging that you're asking about. But really, yeah, it's a great question that often comes up with this sort of work that we do in academia. We have all this interest and we're looking at all these great questions. How do we communicate that to the bigger society in general? And I know that our universities can also help us with messaging of our outcome, and KU is great at that with press release and all that.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is definitely something that's come up in discussion with some of the folks doing COVID modeling, that it's a hard problem, and mm-hmm. what you point to, I think, is right. Is very much to the point that an approach that involves a different stakeholders with different perspectives is really necessary to get this right. So right. Getting the modelers and the communications and the policy people talking together is really what's needed, because nobody can do it on their own, and right. there's a lot of ground to cover with the different skill sets needed. So right. I think it's an interesting problem, and one of the questions being, how can the needs and the goals of the policymakers really influence the modeling efforts that undergo, and how can you make those modeling efforts most pertinent to the real questions? So it's a great set of challenges.
Right, it is. I think it just involves us talking, making sure that we keep the communication line open, and we're talking to each other often, and paying attention to ourselves, I guess. So if we go back to, the messaging concerning the use of masks from CDC, it's a little confusing. Mm-hmm. It's this back and forth thing. Yeah, I do agree in terms of putting out this messaging out, that we need that there needs to be this open line of communication between the modelers and the policy people. It's important. Yeah. Great.
Well, thank you. I don't see any further questions, so maybe we will wrap up. I do want to echo Dr. Agusto's call. If you're interested in the work, contact her, please. It sounds like there's all sorts of interesting opportunities there. And I just want to say in general that promoting the work is the whole point. So we encourage people to make plugs when they have opportunities for students, postdocs, collaborators, what have you. And so thank you, Dr. Agusto. We look forward to hearing more good things from your work, and really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for the kind invite. I appreciate it.
Take care. Thanks, everybody. See you next month.